Yeah, okay, good, so I don't have to be the last one.
That's, yeah, trying to take that burden off you.
I will quote Dr. Pauley Carl one more time, just because I think the thing that has been the most... I like that, doctor. It's a good thing.
I think it should be the esteemed.
I didn't even know what it said. The eminent, yes, only because I think the most, I've heard many profound things from me, and I lump myself in that group of youngish artists who are sort of learning the ropes from so much experience in this room, and I am also in awe of the ability to be here and amongst you. And the thing that I heard was this idea of, I think when Pauley was talking about going back to looking at the publications and Newplay development and how it's this cyclical thing. It's kind of like it all gets repeated. It all gets repeated time and time again. And I don't know why that is, except that sometimes we lose touch with what has come before, and but I would also venture to say that for me, that's part of it. Like, being part of that cycle is what I feel like very much fully a part of right now, is that there's something about having to not know and having to relearn and having to sort of redefine within the context that is so powerful to me, right? That this idea that there's no right, thanks, Jack.
Sorry.
No, there's no right course that can sustain over decades, that rather it is the ephemeral art. It is the thing that is so tied and connected to the actual community, which is why I think this question of audience, I was just wondering where the audience was a little bit, and that's just me, because I'm hearing that it probably came up more in the breakouts, but at these big tables, at these places where everyone was sort of engaged, I didn't hear it in the way that it's become part of my life. And and I recognize you, Ed, and I recognize there's a lot of artists that I've recognized, that I've identified as people that have been inspirations in the work that I've been doing at Longworth Theater. But again, this idea of the relevance of the work, and that to me, that has always been what is most exciting about the new play, the new voice, the new perspective, the processing of the chaos of our world. Like, how do we acknowledge what's happening in Egypt right now? How do we as artists really respond reactively in a way that is meaningful? And I think that there's the local and there's the national, and I think the interesting thing about the networking thing is that for me, networking turns it into a whole. The scary thing about networks that I've been sort of listening to and excited about, that has always been the kind of challenge with co-productions, has been this assumption that somehow, a work responds in a similar fashion across the country, that there's actually that there's meaning in that. And the assumption then, of course, is that people like Jason and the National Newplay Network, that they're doing, and the members of that, and I have no doubt about this, and the members of that are sort of, they're selecting the plays because of that the purpose of their selecting plays is because they know that play speaks to their audience. But then that's where the money comes in, right? And the question of money becomes the kind of question, I think, that is a scary thing. The last thing I'll say is this. Because I think this is true of devised work, and one of the reasons that devised work is so interesting is because devised work is so nimble about that sort of thing. Like a devised play, they can adapt. If it's an ensemble that's creating and speaking the words, they can adapt in the moment to whatever is happening in the world. So things can be improvised on stage, for instance. And it's so amazing to be here in this space, though, because in the course of this whole idea of devised work, we've also been leaving this idea of space, of a theater, as more than just a building. And I think to be here at Arena Stage in this building, which was always kind of hallowed ground to me, and is now in its way even more so, that there is this sense that the act of theater making and the act of theater creating creates that. And that can happen anywhere. Absolutely it can happen anywhere. But just, again, this idea of audience and this idea of our relevance and our responsibility as theater makers to create a space for discourse, right? The forums. That this is. All this is a forum. All this is a forum for a very specific group of people. But that's what I love about the plays that you all do and sort of throw out into the world, is that those create forums. Like each play, each work is a conversation waiting to happen.
If I'd known you were going to be that eloquent, I'd have let you go last.
Ed, can I ask a question? Do we have time for me to ask? I wanted to ask Shay a question.
Sure.
Can you help me there's the self-referentialism. Okay. It's not me. Us understand another way of talking about diversity then that does include class, that does include aesthetics, but that also does address, I think the reason it comes out always as race for me is because that's the most visible way to see what's not happening. It's harder to talk about, I'm not seeing as much of a diversity of aesthetics because we don't even know how to talk about aesthetics, and that's almost as scary as talking about race. But what would you suggest is a new way for us to do it?
That's a question.
And I asked you because you said something that made me that really was kind of getting to it, and I think did I put you on the line? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't know if I want to be on
just
that
said it has
line,
to-
but yeah.
the breadth of
Observation about
elements.
it because it's Neil Barkley with the National Black Arts Festival, and part of it is that we have to be intentional, particularly as people of color, frankly, about not always talking about ourselves in terms of racial, the racial lens, so that if we can begin to talk about our work in terms of the aesthetic underpinnings of it, or in terms of the fact that even our own audiences, within our own audiences, there are divisions of class and aesthetic interests.
Absolutely.
And not always
It's not
begin that
monolithic.
conversation.
That's right.
I mean, this is what I think Shay was in a way getting at.
Yeah, I did
at least
too.
what I heard is
That's what I
that
was
the sort of responsibility for even artists of color to begin to frame their own work and contributions in ways other than racial, and not just for themselves, but for the audiences
audience, right. To help the
that
audience.
they're trying to serve. Because in some ways, our audiences are reflecting what we're interested in.
Right.
A lot of our plays are charged with racial issues or history or a particular cultural tradition. And until we can begin to then talk about ourselves in ways that animate issues of class or issues of internationalism, right?
Geography,
The fact that our
gender,
communities are gender or age, then we're putting ourselves in that box.
Totally.
And we need to help people find a way into a new set of conversations.
Yeah.
This is where you got to lead
Right.
that change.
And also, I mean, one of the things that I'm so struck by is looking at this table, this immediate table, this circle, whoever is watching, this would not have been in 1982, or even 10 years ago necessarily, or maybe 5 years ago, conceivably, but not 10. And so when you said that you haven't seen change, there has been change, but not maybe the kind of change we want to see. I mean, those of us maybe that are thinking in a far-reaching, broader perspective that includes class and race and, let's get beyond a lot of the basic discussions. But this table is it's a moment in time that speaks loudly. When I have to say, when I sat down and it was just, you weren't sitting here yet, but it was Sandra, Camilla, Shay, and Neil. I said, oh, okay, all of the people of color are going to be at the table. And then Eric sat down, I thought, oh, okay. And then it was like Tanya or Lydia. But then, and so I think this is a very, very different table. We have to recognize that here. Not to be self-congratulatory, because we have Exactly. It's like, what is then our responsibility to take this table forward into its next iteration? It's a huge responsibility. You have to grab that. This is the dare to. We better do it.
We got to do
Sure.
it.
We better do it.
And I think it's also the acknowledgement of our own individual communities as a part of the larger community.
That's right.
And we don't talk about that enough. Like for instance, in my organization, the question of race, I don't know if we've ever, that's not a conversation we ever have when it comes to diversity. I can't even, no, we just don't talk. That's not what we talk about as it comes to diversity. It's about aesthetics. I'll tell you one conversation we had. There was a young writer, Shanaka Hodge, came up to me a few years ago, 3 years ago, young writer, and she says, you know what, I don't think you are representing the hip hop generation of artists because every writer I see on your stage is 35 and above. And I was like, hold up, what? Because when we started the organization, we were all 20-somethings, right? But now we're 30 and 40-something, right? So I just say that to say, the question of diversity and how we're serving our audiences are very different. So I think it's about when we come to convenings where there's so many different audience specificities and community specificities, is hearing how we deal with those individual challenges in our own communities and discussing how we've overcome that, as opposed to this uber national, the world of theater and how, you know what I mean?
But then I guess the thing I get stuck on is it's the building of those institutions so that we have the room to have the diversity, to have the freedom to talk about the subtleties. It is very difficult to talk about the subtleties of race and class when only one story gets to get told a year. And so that, and when the stories are located in places that have rather homogeneous audiences. And so I think that's where it feels very complicated, and to some degree, as a self-identified playwright of color, if I know I feel a certain responsibility actually to unpack that conversation over and over in more and more complex ways. So I continue to wrestle with that.
I would just ask you to maybe shift the lens. And okay, so that is the challenge, that is the problem, and that's been historically the problem. So it's the what if question. You want to make the change, what if this change happened, what would you have to do to get us there? And that's where I want to be focused on. I want to be focused on the action to get us there. And I think that's a shifting of the lens that all of us at this table, in this circle, and whoever's watching, has to shift to. Otherwise, we're going to have the same conversation. Come on.
Then this is the shifting of the language also of how we speak about it. And I think that's the question I was asking.
I think
I'm
that
not
has to be
coming down
part
on
of
it.
it.
I'm just saying, let's take it up then, okay?
From our various places.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm
And
going
roles.
to
Sorry.
insert just for a second. Only to say three things. The first thing is that we seem to have reached a really kind of critical mass of energy, which is really exciting, and we want to try to take that then into the breakouts that are about to follow. And then there's two things that, because who knows if I'm going to get a chance at the mic again, so I just got to say them. So one is something that I'm hearing, which is that there is maybe a tension between acknowledging that this is an idiosyncratic art and that we are idiosyncratic artists and have idiosyncratic processes, and how that aligns with the notion of a model and trying to sort of codify what we do. And that, I think, part of what we're struggling against is how to make those two things mesh. And then the other thing I want to say is that the conversation has been really terrific about sort of internal, about our mechanisms and our processes, and connecting a little bit to what we were just talking about from Eric and from Amelia, that it seems to me like the challenges that we face are inseparable from the notion of where theater sits in our culture. And that the fact that only a very, very, very small percentage of people have understanding or appreciation for this thing that we do is sort of part of the environment in which the challenges that we face get created. And so that any conversation about next steps or about how to meet those challenges or new models or new processes has to in some way account for that fact. That it has to also do with not only looking inwards about our own work, but also about how do we amplify or adjust or talk about the way in which theater itself can play a meaningful and substantive role in people's lives. So those are just the two things I wanted to point out. So,
can I just bring up just one really, hopefully, relatively quick thing? I don't know if Jim Nicola is in the house. In a breakout yesterday, one of the things that I think hasn't come up, and this was echoed in our